The Hayes family estate stood imperious against the autumn sky, red brick and white columns announcing Old Boston money to anyone who passed. I sat in my Tesla for several minutes, watching family members arrive in their predictable luxury vehicles. Cameron's Porsche, my cousin Edward's Range Rover, Aunt Patricia's chauffeured Bentley. The Forbes magazine rested on the passenger seat. I slipped it into my leather portfolio before stepping out into the crisp October air. Marcus. My mother's voice carried across the circular driveway as I approached. Eleanor Hayes, ever the perfect hostess, descended the front steps with practiced grace. We weren't sure you'd actually come. Her embrace felt tentative, as if I were a volatile substance that might react unpredictably to pressure. She pulled back, appraising me with new eyes. Your father will be thrilled, she said, though her tone suggested uncertainty. The grand foyer smelled of beeswax polish and the cinnamon apple potpourri my mother had used since I was a child. Familiar voices echoed from the back of the house, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the meticulously maintained garden. Is that him? Marcus actually showed. Cameron's voice, followed by approaching footsteps on marble. My brother appeared, tumbler of whiskey already in hand though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. The prodigal son returns. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he clapped me on the shoulder with unnecessary force. Hello, Cameron, I replied evenly. How's the fund performing this quarter? A flicker of something, annoyance? Worry? Crossed his face. We're adjusting strategies given the market. Nothing to concern yourself with. Marcus. My father's baritone announced his presence before he appeared from his study. Richard Hayes, 64 but looking 55 through sheer force of will and expensive tailoring. You're looking well. Success agrees with you. He extended his hand, which I shook firmly. 20 years ago, I'd have given anything for the pride I now detected in his eyes. Congratulations are in order, he continued. Forbes no less. I had Janice frame a copy for my office. Of course he had. Now that it was impressive. Now that it reflected well on the Hayes name. Thank you, I said, revealing nothing of my thoughts. I brought my own copy, actually. As I pulled the magazine from my portfolio, a hush fell over the growing crowd of relatives. The cover photo seemed brighter somehow, more definitive in this space where I'd always been diminished. The Power Revolution, my father read aloud. Quite the headline. They're calling it the most significant advancement in energy storage of the decade, I said, watching their faces. The Hayes name associated with something other than finance. Imagine that. My mother swooped in with practiced social grace. Let's all move to the garden. The caterers have outdone themselves this year. The reunion progressed predictably, cousins congratulating me with varying degrees of sincerity, Uncle Thomas asking if I'd considered going public, Aunt Patricia wondering if I'd finally buy a proper house. I navigated it all with a detached pleasantness, watching, waiting. It was during the dessert course that I made my strategic retreat to the house, ostensibly to use the restroom. Instead, I took the familiar path toward my father's study. Voices drifted from behind the partially closed door. Becoming a problem, Cameron was saying. He'll figure it out eventually. He hasn't yet, my father replied. And by the time he does, it won't matter. The question is whether Olivia has secured access to the full patents. I froze, blood rushing to my ears. Last I heard she was close, Cameron said. But after that Forbes piece, Marcus is being courted by every major energy company. If he accepts any of those offers before we... He won't, my father cut in. Your brother may be brilliant with his batteries, but he's always been naive about business. That's why we put Vanessa back in play. My fingers gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. You think he'll fall for that again? Cameron sounded skeptical. He nearly married her once. Men have blind spots and women like Vanessa know how to exploit them. A laugh from Cameron. Poor Marcus. Always the last to know. I backed away silently, decades of navigating this house without drawing attention serving me well. My mind raced, connecting dots I should have seen years ago. In the downstairs powder room, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. The successful man on the Forbes cover seemed like a stranger now, unaware of the conspiracy unfolding around him. Olivia, my business partner. Vanessa's sudden reappearance. My own family. When I returned to the garden, I wore a mask of pleasant engagement, raising my champagne in toasts, accepting belated congratulations. But inside, something had crystallized, cold, sharp, and dangerous. They had underestimated me for the last time. The drive back to my downtown loft was a blur of streetlights and clenched jaws. Boston's familiar skyline offered no comfort as I replayed the conversation I'd overheard. Patent theft. Olivia's betrayal. Vanessa's return, orchestrated, not coincidental. I pulled into my building's garage, the Tesla's headlights sweeping across polished concrete. The silence when I cut the engine was absolute, allowing my thoughts to clarify like sediment settling in still water. Think like a scientist, I muttered to myself. Emotional reactions wouldn't serve me. What I needed was methodology. Evidence. Control variables. My loft greeted me with its minimal furnishings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. I'd bought it 3 years ago after our first major breakthrough at Hayes Energy Solutions. Olivia had called it aggressively modern, with its exposed ductwork and concrete pillars. Now I wondered if she'd been cataloging my assets all along. I hung my coat and moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring 3 fingers of Macallan. The amber liquid caught the city lights as I swirled it, considering my options. Direct confrontation was out of the question. They'd deny everything, accelerate their plans, destroy evidence. No, I needed time. Information. Leverage. I opened my laptop and began making lists, detailed and methodical. Suspected conspirators. Father, Cameron, Olivia, Vanessa. Possible motives. Access points to our research. I created a timeline of suspicious events, stretching back months. The pieces started forming a pattern. Olivia's insistence on handling legal paperwork. The Hayes Investment Group suddenly backing 3 of our competitors. Vanessa's appearance at that energy conference in Chicago last month. Not coincidental after all. By 3 in the morning, my dining table was covered with notes and my second glass remained untouched. I needed surveillance equipment. Access to communications. A way to monitor Olivia without raising suspicion. My phone buzzed with a text message. Couldn't sleep either? Dinner was interesting. Coffee tomorrow? Vanessa. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. Was she reaching out because she couldn't sleep, or because she was reporting to my father? I stared at her message for a long minute before typing, sure. Riverside Cafe. Noon. Setting the phone down, I crossed to the windows. The city stretched before me, most buildings dark save for scattered office lights where other insomniacs pursued their obsessions. Among them, perhaps, were those plotting against me. I needed allies. Daniel Kovacs, my lab assistant, came to mind, brilliant, loyal, with a healthy skepticism toward corporate politics. But could I trust anyone? I remembered the business card I'd received at a fundraiser last week. Nora Reynolds, investigative journalist specializing in corporate corruption. I dismissed her then as another reporter chasing the next big tech story. Now, perhaps our interests might align. Sleep was impossible. Instead, I showered and changed, then drove to the research facility in the pre-dawn darkness. The building stood silent and empty, bathed in security lighting. I used my keycard and bypassed the normal entrance, taking the service elevator to our floor. Our lab, my lab, sprawled across the top floor of the converted warehouse. The prototype batteries sat in their testing chambers, sleek and unassuming despite the revolution they represented. 94% more efficient than anything on the market. Scalable from cell phones to power grids. The culmination of 7 years' work. And my family wanted to steal it. I sat at my workstation and accessed the security cameras, downloading the past month of footage to an external drive. Then I installed small, unobtrusive cameras of my own, one with a view of Olivia's desk, another overlooking the filing cabinets where our patent documents were kept. Marcus. Daniel's voice startled me. He stood in the doorway clutching a coffee cup, looking rumpled and surprised. You're here early. Couldn't sleep, I replied, casually pocketing the remaining cameras. Thought I'd get a head start on the day. He nodded, accepting this without question. I've been here all night actually. The thermal stability tests on batch 17 showed some anomalies. Nothing critical, but I wanted to monitor them personally. Dedicated as always. But was he too dedicated? I studied his face for signs of deception and found only exhaustion and caffeine dependence. Good man, I said, clapping him on the shoulder. Send me the data when you have it compiled. As I left, I placed another camera in the hallway angled toward the server room. By noon, when I was to meet Vanessa, I would have eyes throughout the facility. The morning sun crested the harbor as I drove home to change. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Board members asking about the Bloomberg interview. Need to prep. Early lunch. I smiled grimly as I typed, perfect timing. We have much to discuss. Indeed we did. But not what she expected. The chess pieces were in motion. I had been the last to know, but I would be the first to act. Riverside Cafe occupied prime real estate along the Charles, popular among the tech and biotech professionals from nearby offices. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner table with a view of both entrances and the street. Old habits from my competitive chess days: always anticipate your opponent's moves. Vanessa arrived precisely on time. She'd always been punctual, one of the many qualities that had drawn me to her 4 years ago. She paused at the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes found mine. A practiced smile bloomed on her face. I stood as she approached, studying her with new awareness. Her dark hair fell in the same elegant waves, her walk still had that confident sway, but now I saw the calculation beneath every movement. "Marcus," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Her perfume was the same, jasmine and something uniquely her. "You're looking remarkably well for someone who appeared so uncomfortable at last night's family gathering." I pulled out her chair. Family reunions have never been my natural habitat. The waiter appeared with water and menus. Vanessa ordered a sparkling water with lime, exactly as she would have years ago. "I ordered for both of us," I said after the waiter left. "You still prefer the salmon niçoise?" Surprise flickered across her face. Genuine, I thought. "You remember?" "I remember everything, Vanessa." I kept my tone light, conversational. "Including how suddenly you ended our engagement." She looked down, fingers toying with her napkin. A practiced gesture of contrition. "That's part of why I reached out, Marcus. Being at that energy conference in Chicago, seeing your work featured, it made me realize what I walked away from." "My work or me?" I asked, allowing a hint of bitterness to surface. "Both." Her eyes met mine, wide and seemingly sincere. "I made a terrible mistake, Marcus. I was young, scared of committing to someone so brilliant. I felt inadequate." The waiter returned with our drinks. I took a sip of my black coffee, watching her over the rim. "And now?" I prompted. "Now I'm older. Wiser." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "And still drawn to you." I allowed myself to appear affected by her touch, even as I noted how perfectly timed her reappearance was with my family's scheme. "It's been 4 years," I said. "I'm not the same person." "Neither am I." She squeezed my hand. "But some connections don't fade, do they?" Our food arrived. Indeed, salmon niçoise for her, roasted chicken for me. She remembered my preferences too, it seemed. "Tell me about your new position," I said, redirecting the conversation. "Boston seems a significant move from San Francisco." Vertex Pharmaceuticals made an offer I couldn't refuse. The lie rolled smoothly off her tongue. "Head of Corporate Communications." But honestly, I would have considered any excuse to come back east. California never felt like home. And running into me at the Chicago conference was purely coincidental? Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Of course. Why would you think otherwise?" "Just curious." I smiled. The universe works in mysterious ways. We spoke of superficial things through the rest of lunch. Mutual acquaintances, Boston's changing skyline, an exhibit at the MFA. I played my part, the successful innovator still harboring feelings for his former fiancée. She played hers, the regretful woman seeking redemption. Both of us were lying. As we finished dessert, dark chocolate torte, another of her favorites, I casually mentioned my upcoming presentation at MIT. "It's a relatively technical talk on energy storage applications," I said, watching her carefully. "Probably boring for a communications specialist." "I'd love to come," she replied too quickly. "Your work has always fascinated me." Of course it had. Especially now that it was worth billions. Outside the restaurant, standing close beneath a red maple shedding its autumn leaves, she looked up at me with those brown eyes I'd once found bottomless. "This was nice," she said softly. "I've missed you, Marcus. More than I realized." I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture from our past. "Would you like to have dinner Friday? My place? I could cook that risotto you used to love." Her smile widened. "I'd like that very much." After she walked away, I remained still, watching her hail a cab. Once she was gone, I checked my phone. The surveillance app showed 7 notifications from the cameras I'd installed at the lab. One was triggered by Olivia entering the patent filing room shortly after I'd left for lunch. I hailed my own cab, directing the driver to Hayes Energy Solutions. As we pulled away, I spotted a familiar black sedan across the street, the same model my father's security team favored. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw your Forbes piece. Interested in discussing energy industry corruption. My sources suggest you might need a journalist ally. Coffee? Nora Reynolds." Perfect timing indeed. I typed back, 4 p.m. Your choice of location. The pieces were moving faster now. Vanessa in place. Olivia making her moves. My family watching from the shadows. But they weren't the only ones who could play this game. Nora Reynolds had chosen a worn-down coffee shop in Somerville, far from the glossy establishments frequented by Boston's elite. The kind of place where journalists met whistleblowers and nobody looked too closely at their neighbors. She sat in the far corner, laptop open, dark-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Early 30s, I guessed, with sharp eyes that assessed me as I approached. "Mr. Hayes," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, no nonsense. "Thank you for meeting me. Marcus, please." I settled into the chair opposite her. "Your message was intriguing." She closed her laptop. "I've been investigating energy sector corruption for 18 months. Your name keeps appearing peripherally. As perpetrator or victim?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "That's what I'm trying to determine." She pulled a notebook from her bag. "Old school. Your technology threatens several billion-dollar industries. That makes you either very valuable or very dangerous, depending on who's doing the accounting." The barista delivered 2 black coffees. I hadn't seen her order. "I've been tracking unusual financial activity around your company," she continued. 3 shell companies have acquired minority stakes in businesses adjacent to yours. All 3 trace back to the same offshore account. I sipped my coffee, bitter and strong. "And you think this account connects to?" "Hayes Investment Group." She watched me carefully. "Your family's firm." I set down my cup, letting my expression reveal nothing. "That's a significant accusation." "It's not an accusation yet. It's a lead." She leaned forward. "Look, I don't know if you're involved or targeted, but something doesn't add up. Your battery technology represents a paradigm shift. The kind that makes powerful people nervous. Why come to me directly? That's hardly standard journalistic practice." Her mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Because my last 3 sources in the energy sector suffered unfortunate accidents before their stories could break." We were interrupted by my phone buzzing. A notification from my lab surveillance. Olivia accessing my private server using Daniel's credentials. "I need to return to my office," I said, rising. "But I'm interested in continuing this conversation." Nora handed me a flash drive. "Financial records linking the shell companies. Review them. If you decide to talk further, my contact info is included." I pocketed the drive. "You're taking a significant risk." "So are you," she replied. "You just might not know it yet." Back at Hayes Energy Solutions, I found Olivia in her office, looking perfectly composed for someone who'd just committed corporate espionage. "Marcus." She stood, smiling warmly. "I thought you were meeting investors this afternoon. Change of plans." I perched on the edge of her desk. "What did you think of the new patent applications? The ones I left in the secure filing cabinet?" Not a flicker of guilt crossed her face. "I haven't had a chance to review them yet." "Are there issues?" "Just some concerns about language specificity. Technical details that could be exploited if not properly protected." I watched her closely. "I'd value your input." "Of course." She pulled out her tablet. "We should schedule time to go through them together." "Tomorrow?" I suggested. "After the board presentation." She nodded, and I noted how her left hand moved slightly toward her desk drawer, where, according to my surveillance footage, she'd stashed a copied thumb drive. "Perfect. Oh, and Marcus." She looked up with practiced concern. "Your father called. He mentioned you seemed distant at the family gathering. Is everything all right?" So they were coordinating openly now. "Interesting. Just focused on the Bloomberg interview," I replied. "You know how I get before media appearances." I left her office and headed toward the lab, where Daniel was hunched over a workstation, his lanky frame folded awkwardly as he typed. "Daniel," I called. "A moment?" He startled slightly. "Sure, boss." I led him to a small conference room, closing the door before speaking. "Someone accessed the test results server using your credentials today. At 12:15 p.m. His face drained of color. That's impossible. I was in the calibration chamber with Dr. Winters at 12:15. "I know." I kept my voice neutral. "Your password hasn't been changed in 13 months. "I'll change it immediately," he stammered. "Do you think we've been hacked?" In a manner of speaking. I studied his reaction. Genuine distress or excellent acting? "I've implemented additional security protocols. For now, tell no one about this conversation." He nodded vigorously, relief evident in his posture. After he left, I locked the conference room door and inserted Nora's flash drive into my laptop. The files confirmed what she'd suggested: a complex network of shell companies creating a financial web around Hayes Energy Solutions. The pattern was elegant, almost artistic in its complexity. My father's signature strategy. But there was something else: references to Project Eclipse in several encrypted communications. The same code name I'd found in fragments on Olivia's discarded meeting notes last month. I returned to my office and accessed the secure server containing our most valuable research. Using an encryption algorithm of my own design, I modified the critical files. Not enough to render them unusable, but enough to create catastrophic failures if anyone attempted to implement the technology without specific corrections only I possessed. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa: looking forward to Friday. Should I bring wine? I stared at her message, remembering how I'd once built my future around her. Now she was just another node in this network of betrayal. Read, I texted back. Something bold that can age well. Unlike trust, which once broken, never truly recovers. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of penetrating dampness that seeps into bones and buildings alike. I arrived at the lab by 6, well before even the most dedicated researchers. The emptiness felt appropriate, a physical manifestation of the hollow feeling that had taken residence in my chest since overhearing my father's conversation. I'd spent the night reviewing camera footage, cross-referencing timelines, and analyzing the data from Nora's flash drive. The picture it painted was comprehensive, a coordinated effort to extract my technology through multiple channels. But questions remained. Who else was involved? How far would they go? The lab door opened, startling me. Daniel stood in the doorway, hair disheveled, clutching his ever-present coffee mug. You're here early again, he said, blinking in surprise. As are you. I closed my laptop. Trouble sleeping? He shrugged, moving to his workstation. Had some ideas about the thermal stability issue. Thought I'd run simulations before the board presentation. He paused, fidgeting with a pen. Did you find anything about the security breach? A perfect opening. Actually, yes. I traced the access point. I pulled up a fabricated log on my screen. Someone from Vertex Pharmaceuticals network. His brow furrowed. Vertex? Why would a pharmaceutical company care about battery tech? Exactly the question I asked myself. I watched him carefully. Especially since Vanessa Morgan recently joined their communications department. Your ex. Daniel's surprise seemed genuine. That's quite a coincidence. In my experience, Daniel, coincidences often aren't. I moved closer, lowering my voice. I need someone I can trust. Someone without connections to my family or their associates. Daniel set down his coffee, meeting my gaze directly. You can trust me, Marcus. I've dedicated 4 years to this project because I believe in what we're doing. Clean energy matters. His eyes held steady. No micro-expressions indicating deception. Still, I needed more than intuition. Then I need your help with something discreet. I handed him a flash drive. These are modified versions of our core algorithms. I want you to implement them in a parallel system. Off the main servers, accessible only through your workstation. A backup, he asked. Insurance? I corrected. Tell no one. Not even Olivia. He pocketed the drive, nodding solemnly. Consider it done. Whether he passed this test would tell me everything I needed to know. The board presentation proceeded predictably. Olivia delivered her portion with practiced corporate polish, emphasizing market potential while glossing over implementation timelines. I followed with technical specifications, deliberately omitting certain critical aspects. My own test of who might notice. No one did. Not even board member Gregory Chin, who supposedly held a doctorate in electrical engineering. Afterward, as attendees mingled over catered sandwiches, I felt my phone vibrate. Nora Reynolds, found more connections. Your partner's brother works for Helix Dynamics, subsidiary of Hayes Investment Group's newest acquisition. Another piece of the puzzle. Olivia's younger brother Thomas, whom she'd helped place at Helix 8 months ago. Family connections, she'd explained at the time. Family indeed. I texted back, need to meet. 7 p.m.? Her response came quickly, same place. Bring your appetite for conspiracy. Across the room, I caught Olivia watching me, her expression carefully neutral as she conversed with 2 investors. I raised my water glass slightly in acknowledgement. She smiled, excused herself, and approached. Impressive presentation, she said. Though you seem to skip some details on the phase integration protocol. So she had noticed. Just streamlining for the board's attention span, I replied. We can elaborate in the technical appendix. Of course. She placed a hand on my arm. Marcus, I've been meaning to ask, how are things with your family? Cameron mentioned there was some tension at the reunion. The casual insertion of my brother's name, confirming yet another connection. Nothing unusual, I said lightly. Family dynamics rarely change. Speaking of which, how's Thomas enjoying Helix? Still working on their energy storage integration. Her hand tensed slightly on my arm before withdrawing. He's thriving. Mentioned they're exploring some promising new tech partnerships. I'm sure he is, I replied, smiling. Family connections can be so valuable. That evening, I met Nora at the same Somerville coffee shop, now transformed into a sparsely populated dinner spot. She was already seated with 2 bowls of soup and crusty bread. Hope you like lentil, she said as I sat down. This place only serves 1 soup each day, but it's always good. I tasted it, hearty and well-seasoned. You've been busy. Likewise, I assume. She pulled out her laptop. I've mapped additional connections. Olivia Chen's brother isn't just employed by Helix, he oversees their acquisition strategy. And 3 months ago, they began aggressively pursuing startups with complementary technology to yours. They're building a technological moat, I observed. Acquiring all adjacent innovations so they control the entire ecosystem once they have my core technology. She nodded. Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. She turned her laptop toward me, displaying a document with Harvard Business School letterhead. Olivia's graduate thesis from 7 years ago, supervised by none other than Richard Hayes. Your father. I stared at the document, a cold weight settling in my stomach. They've been planning this for nearly a decade. It appears so. Nora studied me. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I stirred my soup absently. What I do best. Create a solution to a complex problem. And the journalist in me is supposed to just wait patiently for this solution to reveal itself? I met her gaze. The story you'll get will be worth the wait. But I need time. She closed her laptop. Time is exactly what your opponents are trying to eliminate. Whatever you're planning, I suggest you accelerate it. I already have, I replied, thinking of the tests I'd set in motion. Tomorrow will be very illuminating. Thursday evening found me back at the Hayes estate, this time for the monthly family dinner my mother insisted upon maintaining despite the fractured relationships beneath our polished veneer. I arrived deliberately 10 minutes late, allowing most of the family to assemble before my entrance. Rain pelted against the Bentley as Jenkins, our family's longtime chauffeur, held an umbrella for me. I'd chosen to leave my Tesla at home, arriving instead in an Uber that dropped me a block away. Let them think I was still unaware, still compliant. Master Marcus, Jenkins said, his weathered face creasing with a genuine smile. It's good to see you, sir. Jenkins had been driving Hayes family members since before I was born. He'd sneaked me ice cream after failed piano recitals and driven me to science competitions my parents had been too busy to attend. Good to see you too, Jenkins, I replied, meaning it. How's Emily? Still teaching 4th grade. His eyes brightened at the mention of his daughter. 5th grade now, sir. And expecting her first in December. Congratulations, I said, making a mental note to send a gift. Some relationships remained untainted. The foyer was warm and bright, the scent of my mother's favorite lilies mixing with roasting meat from the kitchen. Voices carried from the formal dining room, already energetic with wine-fueled conversation. My mother spotted me first, rising from her seat at the long mahogany table with practiced grace. Marcus, darling. We were just discussing your Forbes feature. All eyes turned toward me, my father at the head of the table, Cameron to his right, Aunt Patricia and Uncle Thomas, Cousin Edward and his wife Stephanie. And, surprisingly, Vanessa. Vanessa, I said, allowing appropriate surprise to color my tone. I didn't expect to see you here. She smiled, elegant in a navy dress that matched her eyes precisely. Your mother kindly invited me when we ran into each other at Barney's yesterday. My mother squeezed my arm. Such a happy coincidence. When she mentioned you two had reconnected, I insisted she join us. Coincidence. That word again. I took the empty seat between Edward and Vanessa, opposite Cameron, whose eyes tracked my movements with barely concealed calculation. So, Marcus, my father began as the first course appeared, carried by silent staff. Olivia tells me you've been approached by several energy conglomerates interested in your technology. Direct as always. I sipped my water, noting how every ear at the table seemed to tune toward our exchange. We've received inquiries, I acknowledged. Nothing we're pursuing seriously at this stage. Cameron leaned forward. That seems short-sighted. The right partnership could accelerate your market penetration exponentially. Or dilute our control over implementation, I countered. Some technologies are too important to rush. Always the idealist, my father said, his tone caught between condescension and pride. But markets wait for no one, son. First movers define industries. As do patent holders, I replied mildly. Our intellectual property position is quite secure. A fleeting glance passed between my father and Cameron. Edward, beside me, shifted slightly in his chair. Speaking of security, Vanessa interjected smoothly, Marcus, you never mentioned what additional precautions you've implemented since the attempted corporate espionage last month. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. I don't recall mentioning any espionage attempt. Her smile faltered for a microsecond. Didn't you? Perhaps Olivia mentioned it when she called about the dinner arrangements tomorrow. Perhaps, I agreed, filing away this confirmation of their communication. The conversation shifted to safer topics. Aunt Patricia's charity auction, Uncle Thomas's new yacht. I observed more than participated, cataloging micro-expressions and unguarded moments. Edward, unusually quiet, drank steadily throughout dinner. As dessert was served, my mother's signature crème brûlée, Edward leaned close, his words slightly slurred. Be careful with the file room at your lab, he muttered, ostensibly reaching for the sugar. Some locks are easier to bypass than others. I kept my expression neutral. I appreciate home security advice from someone in the business. Edward managed Hayes Security Solutions, a subsidiary handling physical security for corporate clients. Including, I now realized, potentially my own company. Family's family, he said louder than necessary. Even when it's complicated. My father's sharp gaze locked onto his nephew. Edward seems to have overindulged. Perhaps Stephanie should drive home tonight. Edward raised his glass. To family loyalty, he said with a bitter edge. May we all get exactly what we deserve. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, broken by my mother's practiced redirection toward coffee service in the drawing room. As we transitioned from dining room to sitting area, I deliberately lagged behind, timing my movements to intercept my mother alone in the butler's pantry. Marcus, she startled, hand pressed to her chest. You surprised me. Did I? I studied her face, the face that had dried my childhood tears and beamed with pride at graduations. Or are you simply surprised I haven't yet discovered what you've all been planning? Color drained from her cheeks. I don't know what. Please, I interrupted softly. Don't compound betrayal with lies. It's beneath you, Mother. Her eyes, so like my own, filled with tears. It's complicated, Marcus. Your father has always done what's best for Hayes Investments, I finished. Even at his son's expense. She reached for my arm. He believes your work is too important to remain in a startup. The resources Hayes can provide are what I deliberately walked away from 8 years ago. I stepped back from her touch. I trusted you at least. Something hardened in her expression then, a glimpse of the steel beneath her socialite exterior. Don't be naive. This merger of interests was inevitable. Better orchestrated by family than strangers. Is that what helps you sleep at night? Without waiting for her answer, I rejoined the gathering, playing my part for another 45 minutes before making my excuses. As Jenkins drove me back to my apartment, I received 2 texts nearly simultaneously. From Daniel, implemented changes as requested. System is behaving unusually. Need to discuss. From Nora, traced Project Eclipse funding. You need to see this immediately. The game was accelerating. Tomorrow, with Vanessa coming to dinner, would be pivotal. I was counting on it. Dawn broke with unseasonable clarity, Boston's skyline etched sharp against a cobalt sky. I stood at my loft windows, watching the city awaken while my mind synthesized strategies for the day ahead. My apartment, typically minimalist and ordered, now resembled the workspace of a conspiracy theorist. Walls adorned with flowcharts connecting key players, timelines spanning months, surveillance printouts annotated with timestamps. Central to it all, a whiteboard with Project Eclipse written in bold red letters, surrounded by question marks. I'd been up since 4 reviewing Nora's findings. Project Eclipse wasn't merely an attempt to steal my battery technology, it was a comprehensive plan to dismantle Hayes Energy Solutions entirely, absorbing its valuable components into a new conglomerate controlled by my father and several silent partners. My own family had planned my company's execution while smiling across holiday dinner tables. My phone buzzed. Daniel. I'd instructed him to arrive an hour before anyone else at the lab. It's confirmed, he said without preamble. The modified algorithms you had me implement triggered security protocols when Olivia tried accessing them remotely at 5:37 this morning. From where? I asked, already suspecting. IP traces back to Hayes Tower. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. And the data packets? Exactly as you predicted. They weren't just copying files, they were testing implementation scenarios. His voice lowered. Marcus, these tests would have catastrophically damaged any system trying to use our technology without the protection algorithms. Which wasn't included in the files they accessed. I finished. Good work, Daniel. Lock down your station and implement the Ghost Protocol we discussed. Ghost Protocol was dramatic terminology for a simple concept. A shadow system that would appear vulnerable while actually tracking every intrusion attempt. Let them think they were succeeding while we documented their every move. My next call was to Nora. I need to accelerate my timeline, I told her. How quickly can you prepare your exposé? The framework is ready, she replied, professional efficiency in her tone. But I'm still missing the smoking gun that ties everything together. Without concrete proof of your father's direct involvement, it's circumstantial. You'll have it by tomorrow morning? Be ready. I ended the call and opened my laptop, accessing a program I developed years ago during my rebellious coding phase, a sophisticated backdoor into the Hayes Investment Group's secure servers. My father never understood that true security required understanding how systems could be broken. His password had remained unchanged for 5 years. Eleanor 1989, my mother's name and the year they'd met. Sentiment, his one weakness. Within 20 minutes, I'd located the Project Eclipse files, comprehensive, detailed, damning. I transferred everything to an encrypted drive, adding it to the evidence accumulating against my family. At the lab, I maintained a carefully calibrated performance of normality. I approved requisitions, reviewed test results, even scheduled a lunch meeting with investors. Olivia watched me with the barely concealed anxiety of someone waiting for an alarm to sound. Is everything all right? She asked as I passed her office for the 3rd time that morning. You seem distracted. Just preparing for tonight's dinner with Vanessa, I replied with a manufactured smile. Reconnecting has been more affecting than I anticipated. Something like triumph flickered in her eyes. She always did have a special place in your heart. I'm glad you're giving it another chance. Some connections are worth revisiting, I agreed. Others not so much. Her smile faltered slightly. Mid-afternoon, I called an impromptu staff meeting, deliberately excluding senior management. Standing before my researchers and engineers, the brilliant minds who'd helped build my vision, I felt a moment of genuine regret for the disruption to come. I want to thank each of you for your dedication, I began. What we've built here goes beyond technology. It's about trust and shared purpose. Puzzled glances circulated among them. This wasn't my typical communication style. In the coming days, you may hear concerning things about Hayes Energy Solutions. I ask only that you remember why you joined this team, not for corporate success, but to change how the world generates and stores energy. Daniel, standing at the back, nodded almost imperceptibly. That's all, I concluded. Please continue your excellent work. As the room emptied, my phone buzzed with a text from Cameron. Dinner tonight at Olivia's cancelled. Father requests your presence at the estate. 7 p.m. Important partnership discussion. So they were accelerating too. My dinner with Vanessa had clearly been deemed too risky to allow. I texted back, can't tonight. Previous commitment. His response came immediately, not optional. Father insistent. I smiled faintly at my screen. Please convey my regrets. We'll call tomorrow to reschedule. Turning my phone to silent, I left the lab through a secondary exit, avoiding the security cameras Edwards' company had installed. 20 minutes later, I was in a rental car headed toward the small private airfield where my father kept his Gulfstream. The security guard recognized me, waving me through with a friendly salute. I parked near the hangar and approached the plane's pilot, Jackson, who was reviewing flight logs outside the aircraft. Mr. Hayes, he said, surprised. I didn't know you were traveling today. Last-minute decision, I replied easily. Has my father scheduled any flights this week? Jackson consulted his tablet. Yes, sir. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. to Zurich. Then continuing to Dubai the following day. Exactly as Nora's intelligence had suggested. The final meetings to secure Project Eclipse funding. Thank you, Jackson. I handed him an envelope. My father mentioned a mechanical issue he was concerned about. Could you send me the maintenance logs from the last 3 flights? Purely precautionary. The envelope contained $500, enough to seem important, not enough to raise suspicion. Of course, Mr. Hayes. Email address still the same? I nodded and returned to my car, another piece of the puzzle secured. My father never traveled to Zurich except for banking matters, and Dubai meant sovereign wealth fund negotiations. As I drove back toward Boston, my phone rang, Vanessa calling for the 3rd time. I finally answered. Marcus, she said, relief evident in her voice. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you about tonight. Just finalizing some details for our dinner, I lied smoothly. Still on for 7? Pause. Your father called. He said you're meeting at the estate instead. He's mistaken, I replied. I'm looking forward to it being just us tonight, Vanessa. 8 years is a long time to catch up on. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her recalculating. I'll bring that red wine, she finally said. And Marcus? I've missed you. I've missed who I thought you were too, I replied silently as I ended the call. Tonight would change everything. My loft transformed as evening approached. Lights dimmed to a warm glow, vintage jazz playing softly through hidden speakers. The dining table set with the elegant simplicity Vanessa had always preferred. I'd chosen the wine myself, a bold Cabernet with notes of blackberry and cedar, decanted an hour before her expected arrival. The risotto simmered on the stove, wild mushroom with truffle oil, the dish I'd made the night I first told Vanessa I loved her. Tonight it served a different purpose, a reminder of intimacy that would lower her defenses. At 7 precisely on time the doorbell rang. I adjusted my cuffs, took a measured breath and opened the door. Vanessa stood framed against the city lights, wearing a simple black dress that highlighted her elegant collarbones. Her hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her familiar scent, jasmine and amber, stirred unwelcome memories. You look stunning, I said, meaning it despite everything. And you look. She paused, stepping inside, her eyes moving from my face to the apartment beyond. Exactly as I remembered. Only more so. I took her coat, noticing the slight tremor in her hands as she passed me the wine bottle. Nerves or guilt? Perhaps both. Chateau Margaux, I noted, examining the label. You remembered my favorite. Some details stay with you. Her smile held a hint of genuine sadness. No matter how much time passes. Dinner progressed with the elegant choreography of 2 people who once knew each other intimately, now performing a dance whose steps had changed. We spoke of safe topics, mutual acquaintances, Boston's evolution since she'd left, the merits of West Coast versus East Coast living. All the while, I watched her micro-expressions, the slight tells I'd cataloged during our years together. Her left eyebrow, arching slightly higher when constructing a story rather than recalling truth. The way she touched her necklace when navigating uncomfortable territory. The subtle changes in her breathing pattern when my questions approached sensitive areas. I've followed your success, you know, she said as we moved to the sofa with our wine. Even in California, your work made waves in certain circles. Certain circles, I repeated, swirling the ruby liquid in my glass. Like Hayes Investment Group circles? Her hand paused halfway to her lips. Among others, she recovered smoothly. Innovative energy technology attracts attention. Indeed it does. Though I've always wondered why my battery breakthrough attracted more attention than similar advancements. She set her glass down, leaning closer. Because you solved the scaling problem, Marcus. Other technologies work in labs but fail in real-world applications. Yours doesn't. And that makes it valuable. Extraordinarily so. Her eyes held mine, intensity breaking through her practiced calm. Do you even realize what you've created? It's not just another incremental improvement. It's a paradigm shift. One that certain people would prefer to control themselves. Her expression flickered. Wariness then calculation. She shifted tactics, moving to sit beside me, her thigh pressing against mine. I won't insult you by pretending my return to Boston was coincidental, she said softly. But my feelings for you were never false, Marcus. What we had was real. Was? I asked, allowing vulnerability to color my tone. Is, she corrected, her hand finding mine. Could be again. I studied her face, beautiful, familiar, duplicitous. Part of me ached for the simplicity of believing her. What does my father want with my technology, Vanessa? Her fingers tensed against mine before relaxing deliberately. Integration. Your batteries combined with Hayes resources could revolutionize global energy infrastructure. while conveniently transferring control from me to him. It's not stealing if it stays in the family, she countered. He's offering you a place at the table, Marcus. A chance to implement your vision on a scale you can't achieve independently. With strings attached. With support, she insisted. Protection from competitors who would steal your work outright. I laughed softly, the sound lacking humor. Like Olivia has been attempting to do for months? On my father's instructions? Her silence confirmed what I already knew. Did they tell you what happens when someone tries to implement my technology without the complete algorithms? I asked, my voice lower now. The ones missing from the files Olivia extracted? Concern creased her brow. What do you mean? Catastrophic failure, I replied. Thermal runaway. Potentially explosive in larger-scale applications. Alarm flashed across her face. Real this time, not manufactured. Marcus, if there are safety concerns. There aren't, I interrupted. Not when the technology is properly implemented by its creator. But in the wrong hands. She set her wine down, mask slipping further. No one wants to steal your work, Marcus. Your father is trying to protect the Hayes legacy, including yours. By sabotaging my company? By sending you to manipulate me? By orchestrating Project Eclipse? Her sharp intake of breath told me everything. She hadn't known that I knew the project name. It's not what you think, she began, recalibrating rapidly. Project Eclipse isn't about stealing, it's about integration. Your father sees threats you don't. Chinese competitors reverse engineering your prototypes. European conglomerates preparing patent challenges. All conveniently solved by surrendering control to Hayes Investment Group, I observed. By joining forces, she corrected, desperation edging into her voice. Marcus, please. Tomorrow morning your father is meeting with partners who can guarantee global implementation. Don't throw away everything you've worked for because of stubborn pride. I rose from the couch, moving to the windows overlooking the harbor. Did you ever love me, Vanessa? Or was I always just the rebellious Hayes son who needed managing? She joined me at the window, her reflection in the glass showing complicated emotions. Both, she whispered. It's possible to love someone and still see them clearly. I turned to face her. I agree. Our eyes held for a long moment. Then she reached up, fingers tracing my jawline as they had countless times before, and kissed me. Her lips were soft, familiar, dangerous. I allowed myself to respond briefly before stepping back. I can't do this, I said quietly. Not until I've spoken directly with my father. No more intermediaries, no more manipulation. Disappointment and relief warred in her expression. He flies to Zurich tomorrow. You've run out of time for negotiation, Marcus? Then I'll have to make my own time, I replied. Good night, Vanessa. After showing her out, I immediately called Daniel. Begin countermeasures. They're moving faster than anticipated. Already initiated, he replied. And Marcus? There's something you need to see in the original patent applications. Something I don't think even you realized was there. The laboratory stood silent and empty at 11 p.m., emergency lights casting long shadows across workstations. Daniel waited by his computer, uncharacteristically tense, his usual lanky slouch replaced with rigid alertness. This better be important, I said, dropping my jacket on a nearby chair. I have approximately 8 hours before my father boards that plane to Zurich. Daniel nodded, pulling up a document on his screen. Remember when you had me implement those modified algorithms? I noticed anomalies in the results, patterns that shouldn't have been there. Debugging artifacts, I suggested. We can address those later. That's what I thought too. He pointed to a sequence of code. Until I traced them back to their source. These weren't glitches, Marcus. They were embedded signatures. I leaned closer, scanning the sequences. Hidden within my own code were markers I hadn't written. Subtle, sophisticated alterations embedded months ago. Someone's been modifying our work, I said, mind racing through implications. For how long? At least 6 months. Daniel pulled up another screen showing login records. Always late at night, always using administrator credentials. But here's the thing, they didn't damage the technology. They enhanced it. He demonstrated, running a simulation that showed efficiency improvements of nearly 7% beyond my own projections. Whoever had modified my work wasn't sabotaging it, they were perfecting it. There's more, Daniel continued, voice dropping lower. I traced the access pattern. These modifications weren't coming from Olivia, or anyone at Hayes Investment Group. He pulled up a final screen showing an IP address origin. MIT Engineering Department? I stared at the information. That doesn't make sense. We have no active collaborations with. Understanding hit me like physical force. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found one I hadn't used in nearly a decade. Who are you calling? Daniel asked. The one person I should have suspected from the beginning. 3 rings, then a familiar voice answered. Marcus. I wondered when you'd figure it out. Professor Whitman, I replied, putting the call on speaker. You've been busy with my algorithms. Robert Whitman had been my doctoral advisor at MIT, my mentor, the person who'd encouraged me to challenge my father's expectations. We'd had a falling out 5 years ago over ethical applications of our research, breaking contact entirely. Someone needed to refine your implementation vectors, he replied, his gruff voice unchanged by the years. Brilliant conceptual work, but your thermal distribution calculations needed adjustment. So you hacked my system? I prevented your breakthrough from failing in real-world conditions, he corrected. You're welcome. Why not just contact me directly? Pause. Would you have accepted my help after our last conversation? He had a point. Pride had kept me from reaching out even when I'd hit roadblocks that his expertise could have solved. That doesn't explain how you accessed our secure systems, I pressed. Your security chief, Edward, has been feeding me information for months, Whitman replied. He doesn't share his cousin's ethics or lack thereof. Edward. My troublemaker cousin's drunken warning at dinner suddenly made sense. What do you know about Project Eclipse? I asked. Everything, Whitman said grimly. Your father approached me first before going to Olivia. I've been gathering evidence of their methods for the Securities and Exchange Commission. My mind reeled with recalibrations. Then we're on the same side. We always were, Marcus. You just couldn't see past your own stubbornness. Daniel watched me with wide eyes as I processed this paradigm shift. We need to move quickly, I said. My father flies to Zurich in the morning to secure final financing. Already addressed, Whitman replied. The SEC will serve warrants at 5 a.m. Hayes Tower will be locked down before Richard's plane can take off. I paced the length of the lab, reconciling this new reality with my plans. That's not enough. The evidence against my father is largely circumstantial. He'll have contingencies, ways to distance himself. What are you suggesting? I stopped pacing. I need to confront him directly. Tonight. With evidence he can't deny or escape. That's extremely risky, Whitman cautioned. Richard Hayes isn't accustomed to losing. Neither am I replied. Not anymore. After ending the call, I turned to Daniel. I need you to prepare a data package. Everything we have on Project Eclipse, the modified algorithms, access logs, all of it. Where will you be? He asked. Having a long overdue conversation with my father. The Hayes estate was dark when I arrived at 1 a.m, save for the soft glow emanating from my father's study. Jenkins answered my insistent ring, confusion evident on his weathered face. Master Marcus? It's quite late. My father's expecting me, I lied smoothly. Jenkins hesitated only briefly before standing aside. He's in his study, sir. Shall I announce you? No need, I replied, already moving toward the familiar hallway. This conversation is long overdue. The study door stood partially open, warm light spilling onto the corridor's hardwood. I could see my father at his desk, silver head bent over documents, reading glasses perched on his nose. For a moment I was 8 years old again, watching with admiration as he managed the empire that bore our name. I pushed the sentiment aside and stepped into the doorway. Working late, father? He looked up, surprise quickly masked by practiced composure. Marcus, this is unexpected. Is it? I entered the room fully, closing the door behind me. I thought you might be preparing for your Zurich meeting. Project Eclipse requires attention to detail. His expression hardened, fingers tensing on his pen. I see. Yes, I agreed. Finally, I do see. All of it, Olivia, Vanessa, the shell companies. A masterful plan worthy of the Hayes name. He removed his glasses, setting them precisely on his blotter. You've put me in a difficult position, son. By discovering your betrayal? By forcing my hand. He stood, moving to the bar cart to pour 2 whiskeys. Your technology is too valuable to remain in your limited control. I offered partnership. You chose isolation. He extended a glass toward me. I ignored it. So you orchestrated its theft instead. I secured its future, he corrected sharply. Hayes Energy Solutions lacks the infrastructure to implement global distribution. Your stubborn insistence on independence would have relegated a world-changing technology to limited application. That wasn't your decision to make. Everything bearing the Hayes name is my decision. His voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composure. Including you. We stood in charged silence, the weight of decades pressing between us. The SEC will serve warrants in 4 hours, I finally said. Project Eclipse documentation has been delivered to federal prosecutors. It's over. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear flash across my father's face. What have you done? He whispered. What you taught me to do, I answered. Protect what's mine. You have no idea what you've done, my father said, voice dropping to a dangerous register I'd rarely heard. He set down his untouched whiskey with deliberate precision. The forces you've set in motion cannot be contained so easily. I'm not trying to contain them, I replied, maintaining distance between us. I'm directing them. Exactly as you taught me. His laugh held no humor. And what exactly do you think will happen when the SEC arrives? That I'll simply confess and be led away in handcuffs? Hayes men don't surrender, Marcus. No, they calculate, I agreed. They maneuver. They prepare contingencies. Something shifted in his expression. Wariness, perhaps even a flicker of respect. Then you understand I've already insulated myself from whatever evidence you think you have. Of course you have. I moved toward his desk, resting my fingertips on its polished surface. The shell companies trace back to Cameron, not you. The communications with Olivia were conducted through intermediaries. Plausible deniability is your specialty. Relief visibly loosened his shoulders. Then we understand each other. Not yet. But we will. I pulled a small device from my pocket and placed it on his desk, a digital recorder with a pulsing red light. Because this conversation is being transmitted to Daniel at the lab, Professor Whitman at MIT, and Nora Reynolds, whose exposé on Project Eclipse will run in tomorrow's Globe regardless of what happens here tonight. The color drained from his face. You're bluffing. Am I? I met his gaze steadily. You've spent so many years seeing me as the naive idealist that you failed to recognize when I became a strategist. His hand moved toward the desk drawer where I knew he kept his personal sidearm. I wouldn't, I advised quietly. That would only accelerate the release of everything I've gathered. His hand froze, then withdrew. What do you want? First, call Cameron. Tell him to abandon whatever contingency you've planned. With obvious reluctance, he reached for his phone. The conversation was brief, his instructions clipped but clear. Now what? He asked after ending the call, tension vibrating through his controlled exterior. Now we discuss terms. His eyebrows rose. Terms? I have no interest in destroying the Hayes name or seeing my father in prison, I said evenly. But Project Eclipse ends tonight. All assets connected to it will be transferred to a foundation I'm establishing for clean energy research. You want me to surrender billions in potential revenue? Incredulity colored his tone. I want you to right a wrong, I corrected. And in exchange, I'll ensure the focus of any investigation centers on Olivia and the corporate espionage angle rather than Hayes' family involvement. His eyes narrowed, calculating rapidly. The board won't accept such losses. They will when the alternative is criminal prosecution for fraud and intellectual property theft. And when the transfer comes with exclusive implementation rights for specific market sectors. Understanding dawned in his expression. You're offering a compromise. I'm offering the only path forward that preserves both our interests. I straightened. You taught me to never enter a negotiation without leverage. Consider this my first real application of that lesson. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked through 10 long seconds before he responded. Your mother always said you were more like me than either of us wanted to admit. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit. If we're negotiating, we'll do it properly. Dawn was breaking when I finally left the estate, exhaustion and adrenaline creating a surreal blur as I drove toward the lab. The agreement my father and I had hammered out over those tense hours would reshape both our futures. His company pivoting to become the legitimate distributor for my technology, my independence secured through ironclad legal protections he would help enforce. Daniel was waiting when I arrived, dark circles under his eyes matching my own. Is it done? He asked, rising from his workstation. It's begun, I replied, collapsing into a chair. My father is contacting his attorneys now. The SEC action has been temporarily suspended while we formalize the agreement. And Olivia? Will face consequences. My father agreed to provide evidence of her corporate espionage in exchange for certain considerations regarding his own involvement. Daniel's expression darkened. So he gets away with it. He loses Project Eclipse and accepts my terms, I corrected. It's not justice in the purest sense, but it's pragmatic resolution. My phone buzzed, a text from Professor Whitman, SEC satisfied with terms. Paperwork proceeding. Meeting you at 10. As I set my phone down, the lab door burst open. Olivia stood there, her typically perfect appearance disheveled, eyes wild. What have you done? She demanded, advancing toward me. Richard just called. The Zurich meetings are cancelled, Project Eclipse is being dismantled. And your role in corporate espionage has been documented and reported, I finished calmly. She stopped short, color draining from her face. He wouldn't. He promised me protection. Circumstances have changed, I replied. My father protects the Hayes name above all else. You've become a liability. Her composure cracked entirely. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about patents or profit. It's about control of global energy infrastructure. There are stakeholders beyond Hayes who won't accept this interference. A chill ran through me at her words. What stakeholders? Instead of answering, she lunged toward Daniel's workstation, grabbing a heavy metal paperweight from his desk. Before I could react, she swung it toward the central server housing our research data. Daniel moved faster than I'd thought possible, intercepting her arm mid-swing. They struggled briefly before he wrenched the makeshift weapon from her grasp. It's backed up, I said, remaining seated despite my racing pulse. Every file, every algorithm, secured in multiple locations. It's over, Olivia. She sagged against the desk, the fight visibly draining from her. You've made powerful enemies today. People who don't play by your ethical rules. People you introduced to my father, I guessed. Who helped finance Project Eclipse in exchange for technology control. Her silence confirmed my suspicion. Security is on their way up, Daniel said, phone in hand. Should I tell them to call the police? I studied Olivia's defeated posture, feeling an unexpected pang of empathy beneath my anger. She had been my partner for 7 years, helping build Hayes Energy Solutions from concept to reality. That won't be necessary, I decided. Miss Chen was just leaving to consult with her attorney. She'll be cooperating fully with the investigation in exchange for consideration during prosecution. Her head snapped up, surprise evident. Why would you offer that? Because unlike you and my father, I believe actions should have proportional consequences, I replied. And because I suspect you know details about these stakeholders that may prove valuable. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You're still playing the game. I'm ensuring all the pieces are accounted for, I corrected. Including those I haven't yet identified. As security arrived to escort her out, Daniel turned to me with a puzzled expression. You're letting her go? I'm letting her become an asset rather than just a casualty, I clarified. Because something tells me our victory this morning is just the first move in a larger game. 10 o'clock found me seated in the Hayes Energy Solutions conference room, surrounded by attorneys, SEC representatives, Professor Whitman and Nora Reynolds. My father sat opposite me, flanked by his own legal team, his expression carefully neutral as documents circulated around the gleaming table. These terms are unusually lenient, noted Sandra Michaels, the lead SEC investigator, eyeing my father with unconcealed suspicion. Given the evidence of coordinated corporate espionage. My priority is protecting the technology and its implementation, I explained. Lengthy legal battles would only delay bringing it to market. How pragmatic, she replied dryly. And convenient for certain parties. My father remained silent, signing where indicated with his characteristic fountain pen, the same one he'd used to sign my MIT admission papers 14 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. As the meeting concluded and people began filtering out, Nora approached, recorder in hand. This isn't the story I expected to write, she said quietly. A negotiated settlement rather than a corporate perp walk makes for less dramatic headlines. But a more nuanced article, I countered. One that examines how innovation can be protected without destroying the systems needed to implement it. She studied me thoughtfully. You're more like your father than you realize. So people keep telling me. I glanced toward where he stood in conversation with Professor Whitman, their body language tense but respectful. Though I prefer to think we've both evolved. Speaking of evolution, she lowered her voice, my sources suggest Olivia wasn't exaggerating about those mysterious stakeholders. There's significant offshore movement around entities that were lined up for Project Eclipse funding. What kind of movement? Consolidation. Repositioning. She handed me a flash drive. They're not giving up on controlling your technology. They're just changing their approach. Our conversation was interrupted as my father approached, his legal team already departed. Ms. Reynolds, he acknowledged with professional courtesy. I trust you'll report on these events with appropriate context. I always provide context, Mr. Hayes, she replied coolly, including historical patterns of behavior. She excused herself, leaving me alone with my father for the first time since our pre-dawn negotiation. She's dangerous, he observed, watching her exit. She's thorough, I corrected. A quality you normally appreciate. He turned to face me fully. The board is meeting this afternoon to ratify our agreement. There will be resistance. But you'll overcome it, I stated with certainty. Because the alternative is worse. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Indeed. He hesitated, then added, Your mother has asked that you join us for dinner tonight. A family matter she wishes to discuss. I felt my guard rising instinctively. More family business? Personal, not professional, he clarified. Though with Eleanor the line often blurs. Curiosity overcame wariness. I'll be there. As he walked away, Professor Whitman joined me by the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Reconciliation wasn't the outcome I anticipated, he admitted, his weathered face thoughtful. Though perhaps it's fitting. It's not reconciliation, I replied. It's détente. My father understands power dynamics too well to waste energy on battles he can't win. And you understand that keeping your enemies close provides certain strategic advantages. Whitman's gaze was knowing. Your modifications to the implementation protocols create a dependence on your ongoing involvement that even Richard Hayes can't circumvent. I nodded, unsurprised that he'd recognized my insurance policy. A lesson from your game theory seminar. Control the essential variable and you control the equation. We watched a container ship navigate the harbor channels in companionable silence before he spoke again. There's something you should know about Olivia, he said finally. Her involvement wasn't entirely voluntary. I turned to face him. Explain. 2 years ago, her brother's company faced a hostile takeover attempt. Hayes Investment Group provided the capital to prevent it, taking a controlling interest in exchange. Thomas became a proxy, with Olivia's cooperation as the condition for his continued leadership. The revelation shifted my understanding of her betrayal. Not excusing it but contextualizing it. How long have you known this? I asked. Since I began investigating Project Eclipse. He met my gaze directly. Everyone has pressure points, Marcus. Even you. It's why I've spent the past 6 months quietly transferring my research archives to secure locations. You think I'm still in danger, I realized. I think power doesn't surrender easily, he corrected. And your technology represents a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. Energy independence threatens too many established interests. Before I could respond, Daniel burst into the conference room, tablet in hand. We have a problem, he announced without preamble. Someone's attempting to access our backup servers. Sophisticated attack, multiple entry points. I was already moving toward the door. Location. That's the interesting part, Daniel replied as we hurried toward the elevator. The attacks are originating from inside Hayes Tower. Cameron, I muttered. Father said he'd called off their contingency plans, but... It's not coming from your brother's division, Daniel interrupted. According to the IP routing, it's coming from your mother's private office. I stopped short as the elevator doors opened. My mother doesn't have the technical expertise for this kind of cyber attack. No, agreed Professor Whitman, who had followed us. But she has access to people who do. And if my research is correct, Eleanor Hayes has been a silent board member of 3 energy conglomerates since before your birth. The elevator descended, mirroring the sinking feeling in my stomach. I'd been so focused on my father and brother that I'd overlooked the most dangerous player of all, the woman who had shaped the Hayes empire from behind the scenes for decades. Change of plans, I told Daniel grimly. We need to get to Hayes Tower immediately. The game wasn't over. It had barely begun. Hayes Tower dominated the Boston skyline, 70 stories of glass and steel that reflected the afternoon sun like a monolith of power. I'd avoided the building for years, preferring my industrial lab space to the corporate sterility of my family's headquarters. Now, as Daniel, Professor Whitman and I rode the express elevator to the executive floor, I felt like a stranger infiltrating enemy territory. The attack has intensified, Daniel reported, eyes fixed on his tablet. They're using sophisticated tunneling protocols to bypass our secondary firewalls. Can you counter it? I asked. He nodded tensely. For now. I've implemented the quarantine measures we designed, but they're adapting quickly. Professor Whitman looked grim. Your mother's office is on the north corner. She'll be expecting Richard, not you. The elevator doors opened silently onto the hushed executive level. Unlike the bustling lower floors, this sanctum of power operated with whispered conversations and soft footfalls on expensive carpet. The receptionist recognized me immediately, surprise flashing across her professionally composed features. Mr. Hayes. We weren't expecting you today. Family emergency, I replied with the easy authority of my birthright. My mother is expecting me. It wasn't exactly a lie. She was expecting a Hayes, just not this one. The receptionist made a quick call, then nodded. Mrs. Hayes says to go right in. We moved swiftly down the corridor, passing offices where curious eyes tracked our progress. At the end of the hallway stood a set of double doors with a simple nameplate, E. Hayes, Executive Chair. A title I'd never known she held. I pushed the doors open without knocking. The spacious office beyond was decorated in elegant understatement, muted colors, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Boston Harbor. My mother sat behind a massive desk, her silver-streaked dark hair swept into its usual perfect chignon. She wasn't alone. Vanessa stood beside her, both women looking up with identical expressions of calculated composure that faltered when they registered my presence. Marcus, my mother recovered first. This is unexpected. I thought you were meeting with the SEC until noon. We concluded early, I replied, scanning the room. A third person sat in a high-backed chair facing the desk, only their shoulder visible from my position. Your cyber attack against my servers made for a compelling reason to reschedule. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tensed almost imperceptibly on the desk surface. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. I stepped further into the room, Daniel and Professor Whitman flanking me. Project Eclipse wasn't Father's initiative, was it? It was yours. The figure in the chair turned slowly to face us. Cameron's expression held none of his usual arrogance, only grim resignation. Hello, little brother, he said wearily. You should have taken the deal. Which deal would that be? I asked. Father's facade of compromise, or mother's digital theft? Both, my mother answered, abandoning pretense. Because both served the same purpose, preserving the Hayes legacy. She rose from her chair with the fluid grace that had intimidated Boston society for decades. Your father built this company on financial acumen. I built it on information and influence. We agreed years ago that you would eventually control the technology division while Cameron managed investments. A future you rejected, Cameron added. I rejected being controlled, I corrected. Not contributing to a legitimate family enterprise. My mother moved around the desk, her Louboutin heels silent on the thick carpet. Everything I've done, including Project Eclipse, was to secure your place in the industry you chose. Your stubbornness forced my hand. By attempting to steal my work? I felt anger rising beneath my careful control. By sending Vanessa to manipulate me? Vanessa flinched visibly. That wasn't the original plan. Oh, please enlighten me about the original plan. Acquisition, my mother answered before Vanessa could speak. Legitimate purchase of controlling interest in Hayes Energy Solutions. When you refused all offers, more direct methods became necessary. Eleanor, Professor Whitman stepped forward. This has gone far enough. The SEC already has enough evidence to bring charges. And the cyber attack now. My mother's eyes narrowed as she regarded my former mentor. Robert. Still interfering in family matters, I see. Still opposing intellectual theft, he countered. A tense silence stretched between them, hinting at history I hadn't known existed. The attack has stopped, Daniel announced suddenly, looking up from his tablet with surprise. They've withdrawn completely from our systems. All eyes turned to my mother, who smiled thinly. A demonstration, not a theft. If I'd wanted your files destroyed, Marcus, they would be gone already. What do you want, Mother? I asked directly. Beyond control of my technology? What I've always wanted. Her gaze softened fractionally. The Hayes name associated with transformative power. Your father achieved it in finance. I secured it in politics. You were meant to claim it in energy innovation. And I have, I replied. But on my terms, not yours. She studied me with new eyes, not as her son but as an equal opponent. Richard agreed to your compromise too quickly this morning. Now I understand why. She turned to Cameron. Your brother outmaneuvered us all. Cameron's laugh held genuine amusement. I told you he was more dangerous than father believed. Indeed. My mother returned to her desk, pressing a button on her phone. Janet, please bring in the Artemis portfolio. I exchanged glances with Professor Whitman, whose raised eyebrows suggested he was as confused as I was. The Artemis portfolio? I asked cautiously. My personal investment vehicle, she explained. Separate from Hayes Holdings. I've spent 20 years cultivating relationships with sustainable technology investors worldwide. Connections that could exponentially accelerate your market penetration. Understanding dawned. You're offering a legitimate partnership. I'm acknowledging reality, she corrected. You've neutralized Project Eclipse and secured your father's cooperation. Rather than fight a losing battle, I'm proposing an alliance that benefits us both. Daniel looked skeptical. After everything that's happened, you expect us to trust you? I expect my son to be pragmatic, she replied smoothly, and to recognize that having Eleanor Hayes as an ally is preferable to having her as an adversary. Her assistant entered with a thick portfolio, which my mother accepted before dismissing her with a nod. Your complete technology, implemented worldwide within 5 years, she said, sliding the portfolio across the desk toward me. With you maintaining control of all patents and core development. In exchange for Hayes distributing exclusivity in select markets. I didn't reach for the documents. And Vanessa's role in this new arrangement? Vanessa stepped forward, her composure recovered. That depends on you, Marcus. My assignment may have begun as infiltration, but... She hesitated, unexpected vulnerability in her expression. Some reactions can't be manufactured. How convenient, I observed coldly. My mother sighed audibly. Emotional entanglements aside, these terms are more favorable than what Richard offered this morning. Review them with your attorneys. We can discuss modifications over dinner tonight. I finally picked up the portfolio, feeling its weight, literal and figurative. I'll review these, but I make no commitments today. She nodded, accepting this boundary with surprising grace. Understood. As we prepared to leave, Cameron approached me by the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I argued against involving Vanessa. Some lines shouldn't be crossed even in business. I studied my brother's face, searching for deception and finding instead a complexity I'd never bothered to recognize. Why are you telling me this now? A shadow of genuine regret crossed his features. Because family should mean something more than strategy. Outside Hayes Tower, standing in the spring sunshine with Professor Whitman and Daniel, I felt a strange lightness despite the tension of the past days. What will you do? Whitman asked as we watched pedestrians flowing past, oblivious to the power struggles playing out in the towers above them. I considered the portfolio in my hands, my mother's olive branch or perhaps her Trojan horse. Review her offer. Counter with my own terms. Establish a new foundation to ensure the technology benefits those who need it most. I smiled slightly. Begin again but with open eyes. Daniel nodded approvingly. And Hayes Energy Solutions? Will continue its work, I replied firmly. With better security and more carefully chosen partners. As we parted ways, I glanced back at Hayes Tower gleaming against the blue sky. For the first time, I saw it not as a symbol of what I'd rejected, but as a reminder of where I'd come from, complicated, flawed, but foundational. The path forward would require vigilance and strength, but also something I'd long avoided, engagement with my complicated legacy. Not surrender to it, but acknowledgement of its power, its potential and its pitfalls. Some battles end with clear victory. Others, like this one, evolve into complex, ongoing negotiations between past and future, between legacy and innovation. I was ready for both.